The horror of the Quirk Wood. When a driver from outside the region follows the winding road out past Forkland into the hill country in the southwest corner of Boyle County, they usually find the low ridges, mist-wreathed vales, and claustrophobic forests off-putting. Peaceful as the setting is, there's something about the babbling branch-wreathed creek beds and bent, ancient trees that invokes thoughts of isolation. The miles-long stints of gnarled woods have a life all their own, making the unwary out-of-towner feel watched even in the shadowy half-light of noonday. They'll tell themselves that Danville, Clarksville, or Springfield are only minutes away, or reflect on the hospitable waves they receive from the locals that roll past. Still, they'll feel cold, alone, vulnerable. As this sets in, consciously or unconsciously, they might turn north for Clarksville, anxious to escape the press of the trees and the slopes. On the Clarksville Road, they'll wind along the edge of the knobs, rolling pastoral farmland to their left, letting them breathe easy as they make for the shouldered, open routes beyond. Skirting the edge of the county, they'll turn on west to Springfield, laughing off the unease of minutes before, leaving the irrational disquiet of those placid hills behind them. They'll have passed a run-down, gated dirt and gravel track on Clarksville Road, only a few miles off the small town's main street. It leads up into the knobs, but it's easy to miss, all eaten up by sticky briars and drooping branches. The outsiders will have been breathing easy by then, looking out over the open fields across the road, never once noticing the gloomy trail behind the looming trees. Leaving Boyle County behind them, they'll never know they passed the most hated plot in the region behind that unassuming hidden gate at the tree line. The locals don't fear the woods around Forkland. No, they know the woods only grow strange around the western end of the hills, where that overgrown road waits wreathed in dense shade. True, some of the old-timers in the area remember an era when the woods weren't so damned foreboding, but that was a long time ago. Even so, the deepest crags and vales in the knobs had always been off-limits to even the bravest childhood ramblings in the hills. As early as 1800, the first settlers trickling into the valley wrote letters back east of chittering voices and capering shadows amidst the trees, giving special mention of the roughest and most foreboding highlands. Stories about ancient stone barrows and cairns, like those back in the old country, were also bandied about from time to time, but sound minds always waved the speculation away. After all, the Saxon and Celtic stock of the hills were prone to superstition, and it seemed quite rational to suppose they'd dragged their fey legendary with them to Kentucky, first across the Atlantic, and then across the Appalachians, to take root in the lugubrious woodlands of the frontier. This rugged stretch of inaccessible forest was termed the Quirk Wood in time, a play on mythic place names in old Ireland. And as the years trickled past, the locals steered well clear of its ominous ridges and meadows. Occasionally, a child wandering the woods would go missing, or animals might wander off the adjoining pasturage into the heights. And though nothing was ever found, that only served to fuel the fire as rumor gave way to twisted legendary. On it went until a strange guru with a stranger philosophy drifted into the region in the 60s, bringing a whole new set of worries in with him. No one could place where exactly he'd come from. The outsider had a way of talking local misfits in circles, drawing them in with wisdom and friendly company. It wasn't long before he had a handful of fast friends, or acolytes as the most dubious onlookers called them, at his beck and call. First, they rented a small place in Danville, but their neighbors raised such a stink with the landlord that they were not only evicted, but forced out of the town altogether for want of places willing to house them. Though they kept mostly to themselves, and no real crimes could be heaped upon their doorstep, the strange language they'd begun to speak to one another raised a lot of eyebrows, and the control this guru exerted over his initiates seemed caustic to the families of those who'd fallen under his sway. They lodged with an odd old woman in Clarksville for a time, then moved out into a set of trailers around Forkland after the disappearance of several neighborhood cats was laid, rightly or wrongly, on their shoulders. They garnered a dark reputation, for they kept odd hours, and the noises which issued from their dwellings seemed too orgiastic, too feral, to be any sort of sane meditation. Police were called to the trailers frequently, for the neighboring homes often assumed some kind of domestic abuse or wholesale torture was going on, but nothing ever came of it. Eventually, though, the frequent interruptions and hostile watchers must have gotten to them, for they began probing around the area for another option, something which would allow them more privacy. It was around this time they made an offer on a huge tract of unused land owned by a local physician, the better part of which was taken up by the oft-avoided Quirk Wood. The tract's neighbors had reported snooping in the trees as of late, flashlights and lanterns bobbing through the hills, and a man who hunted the neighboring parcel of land swore up and down he'd heard chanting in the woods on more than one occasion as he slipped free from the forest around nightfall. It isn't known exactly how the guru and his flock mustered up the funds for the venture, but the physician would claim years later that fully half of the sum had been given to him in bars of purest silver. Regardless, they bought the tract, and with it, the Quirk Wood. They built shoddy little homes with their own tools and labor miles into the tangled hills, far away from any prying eyes or wandering kids from Forkland. They sold the guru's car, bought up a buggy, and started keeping a scraggly horse and a fair number of goats. The settlement came to be called Quirk by the county at large, though it was called a different name by its residents, one spoken in the strange, guttural tongue they used among themselves. Visits by family members to drop off supplies were always icy, their grinning faces met with sparse words and cold stares. Students from the University of Clarksville's Linguistics department, intrigued by the strange language used in Quirk, climbed the winding gravel road through the shadowed hills several times in an attempt to garner an interview, but were always repulsed, a saga which culminated in their being chased off the property at gunpoint, never to return. The outside world's contact with Quirk dwindled to consist of the guru's weekly rides by buggy into town for what little he couldn't gather or grow in the woods, and that suited sleepy Boyle County just fine. Once in a blue moon, a sheriff's deputy would be forced to roll up the road into the hamlet to follow up on reports of odd screams or flickering flames on the hilltops. But other than being fond of precariously sized bonfires, the residents couldn't be said to be up to no good. That didn't make the horned effigies of bundled sticks they hung in the trees around the property line any less unnerving, though. Nor did it dull the nervous apprehension their solstice drumming breathed into the populace. More than ever, the trees around Quirk carried a weird reputation, and while the people in town might be able to laugh off the strange rituals in the forest, those in Forkland and the neighboring valleys had to live with the capering and the cavorting on their own doorsteps. The hardy locals did their best not to speak of them, not to dwell upon what took place beneath firelit boughs up there, veiled from wholesome sight. Things trundled on that way for decades. A couple of the old flock died off. of natural causes seemingly, and a couple others packed up and left the area, not deigning to talk with any of the prying souls who managed to ask about their time in the Quirk Wood. Then, in the October of last year, a long stint of quiet prompted a check-in on the old cult up in Quirk. The county was aflame with talk for weeks about what they'd found. Truly a shock to the system for an unassuming place which prided itself on placid living. The cult's aged horse had been slaughtered with an old axe and strung up into the trees headed into the hamlet, a task more than a little challenging for a group all beyond their 60s. The goats received a similar treatment, chopped to ribbons and smeared like gristle through the surrounding woodland, seemingly at random, nailed to trees or suspended on wooden pikes. The residents themselves had shared a similar fate, but their resting place had been even more gruesome. They'd been wired together into a flesh-sculpted, antlered buck in the mouth of the ruined old barn on the property, bones broken and torsos flayed to get the silhouette of the blasted totem just right in the tree-strangled light of the autumn sun. The guru himself took pride of place on top of the display. While initially it was assumed the group had done itself in, the contortion of their corpses into so unwholesome a shape gave investigators pause. Even if the group had ended themselves after butchering Quirk's livestock, other hands had erected that crude yet masterful work of biological sculpture upon the hilltop. Moreover, closer inspection revealed the barn had been built over a sort of stone cellar, perhaps much older than the hamlet itself. The collapse of the rusting roof had been recent, and on the pale, carven roof of that cellar, an extensive text had been etched out in strange, foreign characters, written in the mingled blood of the slain. The strangest was the state of the sculpture, the cobbled-together torso of which seemed split down the center. Again, initial assumptions were mundane, with conjecture about rot and shifts in the decaying flesh being made to explain the defacement of the effigy. The blood pooled beneath the rent in the buck's flesh-formed chest proved a point of confusion, however. The dark stains in the grass had been made not by the residents of Quirk, who had died and been butchered inside the barn, but by an unidentifiable sixth person, of whom no other traces could be found in the decaying hovels of the leaning hamlet. Perhaps this was the sculptor, it was suggested, somehow wounded in the process of creation. This was soon brought into question by the sheer volume of fluid which seemed to belong to this unknown visitor. The blood of this sixth man coated the interior of the sculpture's hollow torso, dribbling from the mixed remains in coagulated chunks as the horrid masterwork was deconstructed. Whoever it was, he should have lain dead at the misshapen hooves of that malign figure at the barn's mouth, but he was nowhere to be found. Interviews with tight-lipped past residents of Quirk turned up little, when, that is, the residents could be found. One who couldn't, a man in his early 70s who had left Quirk in the night a full decade ago, became a person of interest, but given the lack of leads on how he might be reached, the inquiries died on the vines by the following spring. And it seemed to Boyle County as if the Quirk would, and the case which it had spawned, would slowly dwindle away, falling back into rumor-shrouded obscurity, to be shooed away as just another local legend born of aging superstitions and moldering memories. That dwindling away lasted about a season. Then the rumblings around Quirk picked up again in August, when the leaves had just begun to change in the gnarled trees of the ancient knobs. A young girl of 7 had wandered out of her Clarksville home around dusk, and a fretful search through the night had roused much of the county. When she was spotted nearly 8 hours later, sloshing through a drainage ditch along the road south out of town, a concerned passerby picked her up, not 100 yards from the overgrown old road up to Quirk. Though she never could fully put to words what had pulled her from the home, her family seemed to think it had something to do with a spate of bad dreams she'd suffered. dreams which the girl insisted involved that old gate in the woods, as she put it. Talk about the hamlet began buzzing once more, and mutterings around Danville and Clarksville seemed to indicate strange dreams had become a regular occurrence, something which made the wandering girl's predicament all the more intriguing. Sleeping medication was sought across the county as restless residents pursued a counter to the eerie visions of nocturnal woodland hills and deep, misty ravines under whose shadow they suffered. Few compared notes on the content of the dreams, preferring to troop forward in silence, but those that did found the similarities striking. Most described an abiding unease, and the unrelenting feeling that they weren't alone in that dream-born forest. Some even spoke of the derelict Quirk Road itself, though no more locals seemed enraptured enough to trot off into the night towards the woods. The whole mood of the region was reflected in the dour weather, which turned south as August came to an end and showed no signs of letting up. Rain was a daily occurrence, and the overcast sky was seldom graced by an unencumbered sun. Thunder haunted the horizons, and local meteorologists were at a loss to explain the sudden influx of precipitation. By the end of October, the region's annual rainfall had been doubled, and its valleys and glens were sodden with the aftermath of many contained floods. Given what was to come, the nature of this deluge has received more than a little attention as of late. It was during the first week of that dreary October, as the first anniversary of Quirk's strange end was fast approaching, that one Levi Maher phoned authorities with an odd story, a story which wasn't lent much aid by the fact that he made the call roaring drunk. He'd just come back from a day hunting on a plot his family owned, which ran through the hills right beside the old Quirk property. He'd drank his fill and stayed to take stray shots and wander around, telling his brothers to go on ahead without him as the afternoon wore on. The daylight had slipped away from him, and as the sunset obscured the deep woods, he found himself straining to see by the light of his phone as he wound his way back down the hills toward the main road. Maher heard several rustlings through the trees, and thinking his brothers had come back looking for him, called out to them, getting no response in turn. The noises persisted, even after he fired his shotgun into the air in warning to whatever was crunching through the leaves all around him. When he emerged into a little clearing in the thickest span of the hills, his stalkers emerged with him, some following in his wake and others pushing through the scrub in front of him, barring his path. They were, he said, deer. Bucks, to be precise. They were entirely ordinary except for, as he put it, their living statue act. Once they'd moved into the open, they held stock still, watching as he puzzled out what was happening. Never having seen white-tailed deer act so brazen before, Maher decided it was time to make the out-of-season kill he'd pondered earlier in the night, and put a slug into the one directly in front of him. It lurched, loping backwards to the woodline and out of sight, but its cohorts didn't so much as budge. Only when he'd shot the second animal did they disperse, and even then they moved almost casually. The strange group crunched through the woods at Maher's back all the way to the road. Though the call was initially shrugged off as a curiosity after it was ensured Maher wasn't hurt, events that were to play out several days later lent it a new, horrid significance. On the morning of October 11th, two brothers were walking the length of their gravel drive off the Clarksville Road. The morning was unseasonably cold, and mist obscured the old Quirk wood across from the property. But they'd heard strange noises from the tall grass along the roadway and, thinking one of their dogs had been hit by a passing car, went out into the fog to investigate. They found their maimed dogs in the grass, but it was immediately obvious there had been no hit and run. The animals had been gored, run through and trampled. The stomach of the eldest dog had been so badly rent in the struggle that its entrails had bled out along the roadside, thrown across the embankment by whatever had driven the animal to the ground. Unnerved, the boys immediately made for the house, unsure what to make of the scene. Only one would make it home. Though the account of the youngest of the boys is garbled and confused, likely warped by the panic of that awful autumn morning, the details are easy enough to piece together. They were perhaps 100 yards away from the road when a group of bucks bounded out of the Quirk Wood at their backs, fully a dozen snorting, loping animals. When the boys realized the leaping deer were headed their way up the gravel drive, they broke into a run. When, breathless and screaming, the survivor reached the porch of their home, he realized he had made the steps alone. His brother was found in much the same state as the dogs along the roadside. The 10-year-old had been torn nearly in two, and his bones had been so badly shattered that it was theorized the animals had made multiple passes over the body, rounding on it again and again until their hooves ground it flat in the gravel. The scene was grisly enough that it spurred the region's authorities into immediate action. Though it was not unheard of for a cornered buck to accidentally gore a hunter in an escape attempt, nothing like the 11th slaughter along Clarksville Road had ever been witnessed, and whether it was rabies or an obscure temperamental disorder, the locals meant to end the issue then and there. Bounties were posted for deer heads, and seasonal restrictions were dropped in Boyle County as families across the region poured into the trees surrounding the old Quirk Wood in an attempt to cull the population there. The first few days were productive, and scores of deer were dragged out of the wood. On the 14th, around midday, a party of several men wandered by chance into the vicinity of the old hamlet of Quirk. Clouded by unease since the happenings last October, it had likely lain silent for the better part of the year. It seemed to them too overgrown, too devoured by roots, scrub, and dying ivy for one growing season to furnish. They almost left the place as it was, for the atmosphere it exuded was more shadowed and malignant than ever before. But the sight of pale color amidst the earthy tones of the deepening fall made them take a closer look. What they found amidst the collapsing old hovels was the corpse of a toddler. The remains were so mangled that it took the discovery of an engraved bracelet the following week to identify the victim, and once authorities had trekked to the poor girl's house, they found her single mother hung from a gnarled birch behind the home. The things she'd written in a scattered, shaking hand on her kitchen calendar chilled investigators enough that they quelled the sensational story, a truly Herculean task in so small and talkative a community. The word amongst Boyle County's people in the know was that Jessica Wolstead, the woman in question, claimed to have been visited by a wandering shadow around dusk each night. In the week leading up to the 11th, she insisted the silhouette of a large doe sat down beneath her bedroom window and whispered to her that they in the trees, whatever that meant, needed company in the days to come. The doe had asked for her daughter, and eventually Wolstead had relented in a haze, herding the girl into the trees of the Quirk Wood, directly adjacent to her Forkland home. When the girl had not returned by the following day, Wolstead had done what she felt needed to be done. Whatever had led to the woman's madness, it was generally felt to be too dark a tale to be told under the shadow of the horrid events already plaguing the region. Better for people to simply consider the Wolstead girl and her departed mother coincidental casualties of whatever affliction had taken root amongst the deer, they thought. A wandering child slain and her grief-addled mother driven to suicide in the wake of the news regarding the death along Clarksville Road. That didn't mean murmurs didn't escape the informational cordons, though, and by the end of October the surrounding countryside was positively alight with speculation about what exactly was happening around Quirk. It was soon after, perhaps spurred to action by the shadow which had fallen over the area, that a pair of linguists from Clarksville University brought new information to the authorities. In the years since the unresolved deaths in Quirk, they'd been hard at work poring over aged inscriptions and bloody scrawls pulled out of the hamlet. Until then, they had considered their translations intriguing glimpses into the belief systems of a strange, if very literate, cult, and little more. Otherworldly as the writings were, the piling rumor swirling through the public mirrored with eerie exactitude the most arcane, obscure portions of text pulled from Quirk, leading them to decide silence was no longer an option. The linguists had begun the previous year by determining what exactly the strange characters in which the Quirk cult wrote were. One of them, a specialist in Semitic languages, had fast recognized the writing as Phoenician, a truly otherworldly find in the hills of central Kentucky. Closely related to Carthaginian, this tongue had lived and died in the ancient Mediterranean more than 2 millennia before. How their ringleader had acquired a working knowledge of a mostly forgotten dead tongue was mystery enough. What was even more confounding was the twisted accuracy of their scripture. Given that Phoenician was known mostly through limited inscriptions and extremely specific texts, it was largely seen as incomplete, with most of its vocabulary and writing system lost to the decay of ages. This backwoods group used sigils and words unknown to the modern world, and while the scholars initially laid this at the feet of improvisation, it seemed so congruent and in step with the rest of the language that even these level-headed thinkers were forced to entertain wild speculations about the source of these new words. After all, if they had been mere improvisations, the improvisers would have to have possessed a knowledge inconceivable outside a tight-knit circle of ancient language enthusiasts. This had made much of the archaic, strangely phrased scrawling from Quirk excruciating to translate. So obscure were the religious passages and exaltations contained in the rotting tomes and yellowed pages dragged down from the hills that the inquiry ceased to be about the bloody end of the community and descended into mere linguistic curiosity, more a hobby for the professors involved than a pressing task relevant in an ongoing investigation. That lasted until word of some of the goings-on in the Quirk Wood wove their way onto the Clarksville campus, and frightening parallels began to unveil themselves to the intrepid academics poring over the writings of hillbilly Phoenicians. The sheriff's department didn't really know how to handle the glut of information the linguists brought to their desks, but several things stood out. The first and most glaring was that the residents of Quirk laid out long passages, perhaps poems or hymns, in which they tied an ominous end time to the woods in which they dwelt. They told of the forest itself taking up arms in service of restoring order. The second was a reliance on dreams and interpretations of them in the writings of the cult, major features of which seemed to resonate with the stories of eerie nocturnal visions which had come to weigh so heavily on the region. The third, and perhaps the most worrying, perturbed its translators not because they recognized it happening, but because it had yet to happen. Among the Quirk papers, a homemade, shabby book of ridiculous scale formed the centerpiece of the scrawl. This book, penned by the cult's strange, rootless leader, had been entitled On the Benediction of the End, and its thousands of pages seemed to have been filled, piece by piece, over the course of many decades. Near the finale, as the scribe's handwriting grew ever more shaken by the onset of old age, there was tell of a rebirth in the mountains, a final offering of blood to slake the thirst of something which dwelt beneath the hills. They called this thing a god, though the writer admitted that term carried baggage that didn't necessarily fit the ancient thing slumbering below their soil. The linguists tentatively linked its sketched images with Adad or Hadad, a Semitic deity tied to storms and harvests, but the writer himself made no such proclamations of identity. Its strange visage was jagged, horned as a deer would be, setting it apart from the bull-like depictions of storied Hadad. He told that it had been brought from abroad, in ages before Europeans, whether Scandinavian or Mediterranean, had sailed west in recent memory. He told that its bearers had brought it to spare its destruction, to keep it free of capture across the water during the fall of whatever homeland they had called theirs. In the final pages, what he wrote was resolute and venomous. It would take its time, the book told, stirring from its long slumber into this strange new world. Its dreams would echo up into the skies and become the dreams of men. Through them, those men would be inexorably drawn towards its beckoning fingers, poised to strike from where it lay beneath the Quirk wood. It would drink its fill from the land and its people, regain its millennia-old vitality, and, once it had grown fat and strong on the flesh of that sparse country, it would slink off into the trees of the new world, leaving only blasted heath, salted waste, and yawning silence in its wake. Whether this eerie yarn alone would have been enough to spur the powers that be in the county to action is uncertain. The Phoenician script was, after all, assumed to be the ravening ramblings of weird, unhinged ascetics, and taking it too seriously was a test to any with even the slightest shred of dignity. Nightmare-addled evenings be damned. Something happened on the 17th, though. Something which so worried the locals that it was believed action had to be taken, even if only in pursuit of legendary. Harris McDowell was returning from a successful afternoon hunt, bearing the heads of 2 slain deer down out of the mountains in anticipation of an impromptu reward. He wished to flesh out his meager savings for the fast-approaching Christmas season, and the culling being enacted around the Quirk wood was just the right excuse to drum up an easy income on the weekends. Though he'd been tentative about coming in alone when his nephews backed out on him, McDowell figured that, as long as he left early, he'd scrape by just fine. Trusting the sun and his rifle to ward off the weird aura the place carried, Harris had made it nearly to the little gravel embankment on which he'd parked when a sensation overtook him, leaving him swaying on his feet just behind the woodline. Someone, he swore up and down, had gently tapped on his shoulder, light as the patter of the omnipresent rain, but unmistakably different. Harris, assuming some local friend drawn to the woods for much the same reasons as he, was making an ill-advised joke at his expense, made to swing round and bash the jester with the leaky garbage bag containing the bounty heads. A fitting rebuttal, he thought. His eyes found the trees behind him, struggling to trace the not-quite-solid, not-quite-wholesome silhouette which leaned low a few yards behind him. There was a bright, sickly light, blinding against the gloomy noon of the Quirk wood's leafy autumnal arches, and a wave of congealed hopelessness battered him like a rolling tide, described by McDowell as all the loss you've ever felt conjured up in one skipped heartbeat. When he was found wandering the side of the Clarksville Road, McDowell could hardly see, and was having trouble finding his parked car, hazy on what had happened. An emergency room examination found his eyes had been badly seared, and that the skin of his face had reddened and begun to peel. Upon his transfer to better-equipped facilities in Lexington, it was decided with no small amount of incredulity that the wounds bore a striking resemblance to radiation burns. This proved to be the final straw for the sheriff's department, who considered the Quirk tomes' references to the fiery visage of their unnamed idol under the hills too alarming a coincidence to lay aside. Though the reasoning behind the decision was kept quiet, heavy equipment was requisitioned from surrounding departments, and an excursion into Quirk was arranged in a whirlwind sprint of harried preparation. The wood itself was closed to outsiders, with authorities claiming the deer had been largely exterminated and citing worries about a coming storm surge flooding many of the glens and hollers as their primary concern. Onlookers commented on the upscaled police presence in the area, noting the uptick in heavy firepower being wheeled out along the edge of the Quirk Wood. But surely it was precautionary, they'd say. After all, the county had seen more upset around that subdued span of eerie trees in the past month than fate had seen fit to offer the community in more than a decade, and if the sheriff's department wanted to keep people clear of Quirk, there was no better way forward. Behind the scenes, more direct plans were being laid, with the intrepid linguists at their center. Curtis Kotkin, the Semitic languages expert whose work had formed the backbone of the Quirk translations, agreed to accompany a team of officers into Quirk proper in search of a stone monument referenced within On the Benediction of the End, one they speculated lay in the blocked cellar beneath the ruins of the collapsed barn, in whose mouth the residents had left their corpse-hewn effigy. His retired colleague, Dr. Whipple Van Horn, had aided more as a codebreaker for the many new words they'd dug out of the texts than anything else. With his health in decline and prior traumas in distant Mesoamerican ruins weighing heavy on him, he vowed to stay behind, prepared to aid in the translation of any new texts upon his colleague's return. The excursion was kept under wraps, with both linguists sworn to silence, at least in the short term. Much as the high strangeness of recent events had bled over into the wider county, it wouldn't do for the public at large to know the sheriff's department meant to chase mythology through the trees of Quirk. When, on the misty morning of the 20th, a procession of 3 sheriff's cruisers rumbled their way up the winding Quirk Road in the pre-dawn gloom, only a scattered few neighbors saw the procession from across the way. And though they took a keen interest in the idea of an unannounced visit to the ruins of Quirk, all they could do from their leaf-strewn porches was listen and wait. Time will tell whether the obscure events of that damp October day will ever truly be brought to light. Now, with the lips of those few who know anything on the matter tightly sealed, information is scarce, and facts are few and far between. What an observer can gather, however, is that something beyond strange happened in those low-slung mountains, stranger by miles than anything which had happened in that remarkably strange corner of the globe thus far. It is certain that the debris of Quirk's collapsed barn was cleared. What was uncovered beneath is disputed, but the entrance to something, called by some among the group sent to investigate a tomb, and called by others a maze, awaited them there. On the Benediction of the End refers to it as the manse, though the writer seldom speaks of it in detail, for it seems to have been considered off-limits to them. Those few accounts pried from officers who'd been in the hamlet tend to agree the structure was subterranean and made of stone, but it is there these similarities end. Though the sheriff's office has kept a lid on many of its foot soldiers, none of the handful who have spoken can manage to reconcile the accounts of the others, or their own, for that matter. One spoke of entering a web of low tunnels after their ascent of the mountain, going down in the early afternoon only to stumble out in the freshly fallen night after hours alone in the dark, feeling his way along damp passages and calling out to companions who seemed not to hear him. Another recalled sitting down after realizing he stood alone, waiting in the gloom of whatever sepulchre it was he saw through the shadows around him, uncertain where his colleagues had gone but banking on their eventual return. It was only when he heard breathing in the dark of the distant hall, and received no answer when he called out a greeting, that he ran and joined his fellow officers on the surface. Perhaps most interesting was the account of Ronnie Evans, tasked with following the linguist. Coming into a sizable room beneath the earth soon after their search party had, seemingly without agreement, split up, they found it well lit by deer antler sconces of slow-burning oil, carved by careful hands into the rocky hills. As the linguist muttered and puzzled over the Punic symbols on the wall, Evans found himself marveling that the place looked so well kept, He gave voice to the worry that someone might be down there, shaping in words that amorphous sense of looming dread all of them seemed to have felt upon stepping into the tunnels. Though time crawled for him in the manse, and Evans seems hesitant to put an exact figure on the period spent in the cathedral-like runic chamber, he eventually found the linguist missing, vanished during one of the deputies' scans of the opposite wall. Assuming the academic had carelessly wandered deeper into the tunnels in pursuit of some line of garbled scripture on the stone, Evans followed through the downward passage at the chamber's end. His calls to Kotkin went unanswered. Unanswered by Kotkin, at least. When Evans plateaued in a hall so low he had to stoop to stay on his feet, the damp dust in the air seemed to drown out his lights and chew up his vocalizations as he shouted down the tunnel. The place seemed grid-like, built of evenly cut stones decorated with jagged, menacing, cervid faces, tongues protruding and teeth bared. His shoes disturbed a silt-like gray mud which, he gradually realized, was littered with many pairs of prints. They were not, he found, the marks of the linguist's intrepid steps through these unplumbed depths. Rather, they were hooved. Evans was the last of the deputies to rush from the ruins that night, to be swept up by the crowd which had gathered to debate launching a second expedition to retrieve him. Screams and ululating, ragged brays and barks had been echoing forth from the ruins since sundown, and the Quirk Wood seemed alive with motion as animals flitted from tree to tree and birds from branch to branch, eyes glinting. Expectant, many would say. People down in Forkland and Clarksville heard the weird storm of sound, but Evans gave it shape in the minds of his colleagues, breathless and ranting of what he'd seen in the lowest part of the manse. Scuttling, he called it, many-limbed like a centipede, but altogether different. Heads and horns bobbed haphazardly in the shaded mists, jutting from a rippling furred body which was shapeless as a slug's. It rasped and slavered, shuddered and groped along the passage, ever nearer. Only the linguist remained in the tunnels then, but not a single man in the score gathered round the foundation of the barn could summon up the foolhardy gall to push back down the ancient stair into the unmapped hellscape they'd mistaken for a cellar. The night was a living thing in Quirk, and though only a couple of their number could put it so succinctly, doom seemed to clutter the air. Not foolish enough to descend, but not brave enough to attempt a flight through the woods, a sizable portion of the sheriff's department kept watch through the night. Lights and service weapons trained on the moldering entrance of Quirk's time-hidden maze. As dawn crept closer on the 21st, the wailing beneath the hill subsided, bit by onerous bit. The birds ceased to shrill in the treetops, and the wildlife sank back into the dull morning rain. Curtis Kotkin stumbled on dirt-stained limbs from the ground, breathless as all those who'd come before, bringing a wave of relief to the gathered deputies. They rallied the expedition, ensured everyone was in good health, and, with a bitter curse toward whoever had erected so strange a sight in the Kentucky hills, collapsed the entrance to the manse. As the shaken deputies retreated to their homes and gathered their scattered wits, though, the silent Kotkin raised many an eyebrow at Clarksville University. Having left Quirk in a state of what officers assumed to be nearly mute shock, Kotkin had insisted only that he was all right and that he be driven home. Before dawn on the morning of the 21st, the linguist was seen by a custodian in one of the Clarksville campus's social sciences buildings, testing the lock on his own office door. Kotkin told the man he'd misplaced his key, and upon having the door opened for him, cleared out the office around sunrise. His former colleague and friend Van Horn, who'd helped him in his translations, called several relatives of Kotkin's later that evening. He'd discovered the younger academic wandering his house unannounced around noon, and their subsequent interaction left him feeling more than a little perturbed. Kotkin, who'd been studiously perusing shelves as if he'd never seen the place, demanded Van Horn offer up all the documentation he had regarding the Quirk texts. He refused to shed light on his experiences the night prior, and, upon getting what he needed from his old friend, he departed without so much as a neutral exchange about the weather, something Van Horn invested with a portentous strangeness. It was Kotkin's wife who had the strangest exchange with the man, one she related to Van Horn during his concerned call. The linguist had cleared out his small study prior to her return from work in Danville, and he'd been stuffing the trunk of his car when she pulled in the drive. Kotkin seemed surprised to see her. Indeed, he seemed uncertain of who she was, initially demanding she let him know what she was doing there. Agitated when she attempted to explain herself, Kotkin had left the home. His car, emptied of his belongings, was discovered the following morning in a ditch along the Clarksville Road, right at the edge of the Quirk Wood. This was the last she, or anyone in the region, was to see of the bright young academic from Clarksville, and to date, no concrete word of his whereabouts has surfaced. Police have begun to turn over stones in pursuit of information on where the man went, but they are hesitant to open up about the intricacies of the situation. Perhaps they fear blame, seeing his involvement in their ill-fated scouring of the manse as a liability. They are, at the very least, more able to indulge other pursuits, for the strangeness which hung like a mist above Quirk seemed to dissipate with the October rains. Few in the county hold the fact that their dreams ceased to be nightmares and their woodland hills grew lively with the sounds of wholesome life in the wake of the 21st to be a coincidence. They clamor about the noises on the hills and speculate about the deaths, never seeing fit to let the makings of a good yarn go completely to seed. Still, after the search parties stopped being dispatched for the missing Kotkin and the bounties on the deer were dropped, they've steered clear of the old Quirk Wood. There's a shadowed air about those hills now, more tangible than the moody legendary that had so darkened them before. It's as if they breathe, locals say, as if the trees themselves pulse and plot and seethe when the dusk comes on, and the dying sun strikes the knobs just right. Within, the dark gravel road is almost weed-eaten, and that old, unassuming gate is ever closer to rusty oblivion. Unseen, the old hamlet leans and creaks in the woods, perhaps fallen after the onslaught of the recent December snows, perhaps not. Beyond, none can say.